All right. Deep Progressive House Track Breakdowns, episode 8. I'm going to break down 2 of my new tracks in this video. I'm going to show you tips and tricks along the way of how I made these tracks. Some really cool stuff, like I'm going to show you how I made this. How I made this lead. How I made this really cool effect sound. And how I made this. The first track is Lost Signal. We're going to dive in, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit more information about the actual release. First, the track is in D. It's 121 beats per minute. Starting off with the kick drum, I have 3 layers of kick here. The top, kind of like a mid snappy bit, and then the low end. All together. A nice deep kick, but it still snaps through and cuts through the mix quite well. Some multiband compression pushing down the highs a little bit and pushing up the lows. Some EQ cutting out a bit of the mud, and some compression as well. Just very slight. Next up is the bass. EQ to pull out some of the muddiness between the octaves of bass. Sometimes you'll notice that there's multiple octaves of bass down here and some harmonics when you're using things like sawtooths or square waves. You can get the root note of the sub, maybe an octave or 2 higher, but then sometimes you end up with these in-between harmonics that come with using these waveforms, and that can create a bit of mud. So I've actually cut that out here. If I solo this, that's an A. My track is in D, and I don't need that up so loud. It does add a bit of warmth and fullness to the bass, but too much and it can make it muddy. So I recommend paying attention to the sub, the octave. Right here we have the D, then another D, and then the A, and then another D here. So it's in between these second and third octave of bass. I'm scooping that out to reduce that muddiness. Some multiband compression. It was a little bit clicky, the sound. There's like a weird clicking that kind of happens sometimes with it, so I've reduced that here quite a bit, and then pushing up the lows and the mids, some sidechain compression, and then filtering with the EQ and automation. For the first sound, I have quite a bit of EQ going on. Let's take a listen to how it sounds without the EQ. It's a pretty gritty sound. It's an FM pluck. We're using 2 sine waves, and then a 3rd octave of sub here. Very full, bulky sound. It's a very bass heavy sound. I'm EQing out the lows and the highs. Now I just have that nice warm grit. I have some sidechain compression from the bass hook. This one here has some mid frequency as well, and I didn't want them overlapping, so when the bass hook 3 here plays, it squishes down the volume of the first one to make room for that so that they're not overlapping too much. And the sound design itself, pretty simple, just that FM. I don't think there might be a little bit of a pluck. Yeah, there's a little bit of a pluck action going on with the filtering to make it a bit more punchy. Some distortion. The delay is turned off for the most part. That should be completely off actually. And there's a little bit of reverb here as well. But, or actually, I guess I can leave a little bit of delay, but yeah, just a little bit because I don't want to add any stereo imaging to the bass or any more. This bass hook is the actual, like the sub of the sound. Lots of bass coming in. I have a mid-side EQ getting rid of the stereo imaging. Lots of hard compression going on. I want it nice and powerful and full sounding. It's the same preset as the FM pluck top before. We have the octave 1 higher and the FM synthesis just to give it a bit more warmth and grit. Really nice sounding, full warm bass. This one up here has the stereo imaging, but this sub does not. And then I just have this accent bass. Play that with the kick. So we have a little bit of width from the first bass hook, just giving it from like 150 hertz up. We don't want anything lower than that to be in stereo. And then the third bass hook here is just to give a little bit of grit and variety to the bass line so it's not so repetitive. And it's the same preset again, just with a bit more cutoff opening up. Distortion, delay, reverb. Opening up the MIDI here, we can take a listen and a look. not the catchiest bass, but because it's so warm and full and I have a little bit of release on here, it fills up those empty spaces and it makes it more of a grooving, kind of like rolling bass. Especially with these octaves here, you can see the octaves up here with the sub, and that gives that nice like back and forth call and answer. Without these, it would be a lot less catchy. That's like an EDM type bass line. And with these, you get that nice swing. Very simple thing to do that adds a lot of variety and a lot of swing to your bass lines. Moving on to the bass hook, we have just the simple. You can hear it's actually opening up as the track is playing through. So we can take a look at the automation here and see that the track is actually opening and closing and then opening again to give that little bit of variation throughout the track. Filter cutoff here as well, slowly opening. You can see it opens very low at 0.007. By the time it gets to the drop, just very slightly more open, and that just makes it for the peak of the track is maybe 5% more aggressive, and that just makes it so it feels more exciting when the actual peak happens. And I do that with the sub here as well, just very, very slight, only up by 0.0. You probably can't even hear that, but this one goes from 0.07 all the way to 0.11 compared to this. It's very, very subtle, but it just adds that little bit of excitement for the main drop. And lastly, for this build up here, I have this delay on this return track, and this has a lot of high-end phaser, delay, EQ, reverb. It's just making this really cool sound so that when it builds up like this, you have this cool effect in the background, and it builds tension with the drop. Very subtle, but it just adds that little bit that can make the build-up feel a bit more intense. Before we jump into the drums, I just want to mention something that I hope is inspirational to you. I wrote this track almost 4 years ago. I only submitted it about almost 2 years ago to Sudbeat. I knew this was a strong track, and I really wanted to wait until I knew I was confident enough to send it into a label as big as Sudbeat. So I decided to wait on it. Every 6 months to a year, I would come back and I would improve the track. I would test it out in a live setting, test it out in my sets, come back with the increased knowledge that I had of writing so many tracks, and I would try to make this track just a little bit better every time I worked on it. And I do this a lot, but this was the one that took almost 4 years to get to this release. So almost 2 years ago, I sent in the track. They agreed to sign Lost Signal, and there was a few other demos that I sent in that they didn't want, but I said that was fine. Let's go with the single release on the compilation, and almost 2 years after that, it's finally been released this week. Sudbeat is a label I've wanted to get on for many, many years, and it finally happened to me, and I just want to let you know that it can definitely happen to you if you just keep trying, you just keep pushing, and you just keep working hard. A little bit of shameful promo here. If you want to support me and you like the track, you can click the link down below or click this link up here, and you can purchase the track or stream it, and it will be very helpful to me. But like I said, only if you want to support and only if you like the track. Keep on grinding, don't give up on your music, and let's get back into the video. Moving on to the drums, I've covered drums a lot in these track breakdowns, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the drums because it's basically pretty similar to the other videos that I have done. If you want to check out more drums videos, then check out the other track breakdowns I have. I'm just going to skim over these and focus on some more focal points. So the hi-hats has a nice swing to it by having the main hi-hat hitting on the 3rd 16th here on the upbeat, and then we have a little bit of swing with the second one. These aren't actually doing anything here. So the hat just goes. You could also go in and add a little bit of variation to here to make them a bit more humanized. In the processing, I just have some EQ, some reverb to make the hat feel a bit more full. You hear that little bit of brightness. It just adds a little bit of sizzle and kind of glues the top end together a little bit more and makes the top end feel a tiny bit more intense as well. And some more EQ cutting out those lows. I'm EQing pretty heavily here because I do have a lot of elements. Next up is the clap. Sending it to a return channel, which has a little bit of reverb. 2 layers. Some saturation to bulk it up. Some EQ and some compression to really grab those peaks. Could also use a clipper for this, which would probably work better, actually. Up next, 2 shakers here. Very simple, like 16th hat shakers with a little tambourine to add some swing. Percussion. Just a tom to add a bit of variation. A nice full sounding shaker loop. This is such a big full sounding loop. I love using this loop because it is really full sounding and I just have it pretty quiet in the mix and it just really fills up and glues the whole track together. If you want some good shaker loops, I also have links to some of the ones that I use in the description below. I get asked all the time which samples I use, so those are some of the ones that I actually use in a lot of my tracks. More percussion. This one's actually a percussive sound that's pitched up like over 2 octaves. It's like a snare sound, and then I pushed it up really high. And then I pushed up that note as well in the frequency so that it makes it more like tonal. Then some erosion to give it some more grit, another percussion. And some offhand perks. These are just like little percussion to keep the drums. Now for the synths, this is the bread and butter of this track. This is where I get that kind of eerie vibe. The key is very minor sounding, even though it is, I think it has like a flattened 6th in the scale. I don't know exactly what scale that is, but I took the 6th note and I pushed it down for most of these melodies and it gave it this really beautiful eerie sound. The synth stab I took from a sample pack. So if you go here, you can listen to what it sounded like before. And then I took a small portion of that, I reversed it, and then I played it here. So take the delay off. Just by cutting up and resampling, I made this interesting sounding. And that plays every so often. It's catchy. Catchy, it's hooky, and it keeps that momentum going. Here I have the actual lead of the song, and this is from a Pigments preset called Final Sunset, and it just has a really like nice kind of bell sound to it. You can hear how eerie it sounds. So I played around with the different notes and different chords, and I actually recorded this because I wanted to make sure that I had full control over the sound and the way that it sounded. So I have the ARP lead bounced down to audio here. And then I took that and I bounced it down again, and I recorded it at a lower octave with some different processing. So some different like reverb. And I have this delay. It just fills up the spectrum so much. It sounds very beautiful, but still a little bit eerie and haunting, and that's what I really like about this song. So both those together sound really nice. They're playing off of each other. They're not playing exactly the same notes all the time, and that gives you that sense of like feeling really loose. Like it feels like you're not to the grid so much, and it gives you that feeling. Like it makes you feel like you're a little bit lost, and that's kind of where I got the idea for the song name. I have some different pads that I've bounced down to audio here. Just grabbing presets from Pigments or making my own presets and just adding a bit of reverb and delay to them. This pad is a preset called Cyber City. Nice like full warm kind of white noisy pad, filling up a lot of that space. These I called Flutters. It's another preset inside of Pigments, and it's just like this nice like consistent energy that kind of pulses through the track to give it a bit of momentum. Called Detroit. I use some automation throughout the track to really control when it comes in and when it comes out. Another pad for some sub melody. This is what you can do to add a lot of value to the melodic side of the track, adding in these kind of one-shot pads, these stringy pads that come in and go, and they add a lot of melodic content and expression. And they keep the track interesting as well. Serum preset, another sub-melody just to keep the track going. The track itself is very repetitive. That lead comes through for a long time, and it's a very long track. So having these presets, these sounds coming through can really help it move along and not feel so repetitive. This is called Gritty Waft. It's a sound I made. Without the Supermassive, it probably sounds a little bit different. And then the Supermassive is there to add a lot of atmosphere and space. Track spacer from the ARP lead, so the main lead that comes in turns down this sound so that they're not overlapping too much. Some more sounds here to keep it interesting. So this is one I called Whitewash Waft. It sounds really cool. And then again, adding a big reverb onto that. And that just carries the track along, especially on the drop. I just have another one here, another layer with a little bit of variation. So I did like 2 variations of that same sound. The lead here, again, just some sub melody. This is a wavetable preset that I made. Big reverb, lots of delay. No automation on that. There's not really actually too much automation other than filtering. So just like filtering things up and down, closing things and reopening them, especially before I drop, closing it off a little bit. Closing and opening, closing the filter before the drop can actually make it feel a little bit more powerful when it comes in. Just take it away right before the drop, bring it back in. And last but not least, we have some more atmospheres down here. There's a lot of atmospheres to deal with. This is from my guitar pack, my guitar pads pack, which is on my Patreon. And it's just different pad sounds that I made using a guitar. Really nice for adding that extra little bit. I actually use a vocal here. So this, I think I'm using a shimmer on this. That's why it's so bright. But then I have this vocal here. I recorded the word 1. I pitched it up and I added some shimmer to it as well. And that is just a random word that I do this in a lot of my tracks. I record a random word or phrase, I put it in, and it just adds a little bit of ear candy and texture. Okay, now I'm gonna show you what I did to make this really cool lead sound. This is like, I love this part of the track. It's so unique, it's so cool. To make this cool warping effect, it's one of the signature things that I do in some of my tracks. So you just have to grab something like the lead, throw on a delay, turn on repitch. The repitch must be on, and then you automate these different values. So I can say show automation, go to the lead, and as it's playing, I want to just bring these up, bring this down like this, maybe add in random ones like this, and see what you can get. Especially if you turn this off and automate them separately, you can get some really wacky sounding stuff. Then I just make a really big automation for that, record it, and turn it into this. You have to play with the automation a little bit to try and find how it works with each different sound. Sometimes it works better, sometimes it doesn't. But I got this really cool sound, and then I took a small section of that really cool warping effect, and I looped it over and over for the main drop. It sounds like this. I like doing stuff like this in my tracks a lot. I like putting in really weird kind of wonky sounds that just really give the track its unique character that people might not really even know how I made it, but it gives it an identity that can help it stand out from other tracks. So like I said, check the description. You can grab the condensed project file for this as well as some free stuff. Lost Signal will work in Ableton 11 and up, and Eternity will work on 12 and up. Now I'm going to break down my track Eternity, which was also recently released on Meanwhile Recordings. First things first, we have the kick drum, 2 layers for the kick. 2 layers of the kick, they're actually the same kick, but I've just gone in and adjusted them separately to just make the phase correlation line up a bit better. And it just gives me a little bit more control over the kick itself, and then some compression to glue it back together. It's punchy, it doesn't have too much top end, and the bass is really prominent, and that's the kick that I need for this, because I wanted like a shorter, punchier kick. Usually I like my kick drums to be no longer than 200 milliseconds. This is a little bit longer, but it is pitched up a little bit, which actually shrinks the length of the kick drum. Nice and punchy, it works well with the bass line. with a big full warm bass line like this, and with this more rolling style, like progressive house, like the Meanwhile Recordings progressive house, where it's a little bit more rolling and of a consistent energy. The kick drums tend to be a little bit like punchier and a little bit less sub powerful because it's more of a full bass line that's consistent along the whole track. For this bass line, I have 8 different layers. I know that I always do a lot of layers with my bass. This is a little overkill, but each of these has their own space in the bass line. I'm going to show you why I have so many. And don't worry, you don't need to make your bass lines this complex, but I just have a tendency to add a bunch of little layers that adds that texture and that complexity to the bass line that makes my signature style. I have my sub layer here. Same thing with the octave. So it's playing and then it jumps up and it gives it that nice movement. It gives it variety and it makes the bass line feel very interesting. Serum patch. I called it badass riff bass. This is how it sounds without the EQ. I have some release as well so that the bass line feels like it's more consistent. If I take this off, it has a bit too much empty space and I feel like that slows down the groove of the track. It's just more broken up and staccato. With that release a bit higher, it feels more consistent energy. It like bleeds into the next bass line. So I have to be careful of that. It doesn't cause any phase problems, but it should be fine. I have my sidechain from my kick. I have a track spacer from this tap sound, which is right here. It's this like woo bass sound. I guess you can hear it. I don't need to make the bass sound again, but it's this like percussion that I have. And I think that adds a nice little... It makes the bass line even more complex. It's very subtle, but it's just, you know, it's there and it adds a little bit to it. Taking out a lot of this sub because it is very, very powerful, and we can move on to the bass top. This is a really low sound. I had to EQ quite a bit. Like 3 EQs, taking off times 4 times 4. Be careful with EQing like this because it can mess with your phase, but that's a whole topic for another different day. The bass top is from a preset called BS Civil. Again, I have links in the description below of a preset pack that you can also grab, and it has a bunch of bass presets like this one. So it's a really low sound, but I have those EQs on. Just grabbing that nice grit, layering that up with the sub. Right, it adds that punchiness, it adds that grit and character to the bass. Number 8 is just like an accent. Love that. That's such a cool sound. So this one is another serum patch, also from the same bass pack. I might have manipulated it a little bit. I like to do that with presets. I grab the preset that I like and then I change it around. So I don't remember exactly what I did, if I did anything, but probably just added that little bit of attack to make that kind of wom sound. And then you can layer that up with the rest of the sounds. And all these layers I add are simple, and they're simple ideas that add value to the loop. They add groove. Right? They're catchy. They're not disrupting. They're there, and you can see over here, I've actually moved that back because I've added attack onto the bass. I need to remove or reduce that MIDI. So it actually will move it so it plays a little bit earlier because the attack will make it kind of play later and that throws off the groove. So I've pushed that so that it hits a little bit earlier so it compensates for that attack. I have this other sound here. So sometimes what I will do is I will record the sounds with things like Tantra. There is just like a frozen sound that I just recorded the bass. Right? Throw some delay on it, throw some phaser, some chorus, some different sound effects, record that, and then I just take pieces of the recording of the delay and I add them into the bass line. It made this gritty little hit. And it's catchy. If I listen to that with the bass, right? It adds texture, it adds detail, and I'll do that again here, same thing. This was a happy accident. Sometimes I would open Ableton and for some reason it would like glitch or something, and this would actually sound really distorted like this. It would sound bit crushed and distorted like this, and I actually liked it. So the original sound was a little bit softer and a little bit more like warm sounding, and for some reason the Ableton algorithm, when you're warping it from Complex to Complex Pro, I would switch it to Complex Pro and then switch it back, and that sound was gone. It was fixed. So I actually loaded up the project until that happened, and then I recorded that sound with that like distortion that Ableton was causing, and then I put it in the track, and I think it works really well for the theme of the track being a bit more aggressive. So it was it was an unintentional addition to the track. This is actually how it sounded before. So it's like this warm bass thing. And with that algorithm, sometimes it would be really shrieky like this. And I thought it sounded good, so I left it in. Last, I just had this little one shot for the breakdown. Very, very subtle, just a big reverb on that. Up next is the drums. I'll go through it very quickly. It's very simple for these drums. Hi-hat, I have a few different layers on the hi-hat, adding a little bit of variation and humanization by moving them off the grid a little bit. And this hi-hat here is actually there to make the hi-hat feel more bulky. So if I take off that hi-hat, open 2, you'll notice that it's not as bulky of a hat. So I use a hat that has a bit more of a slower attack, and I use that to extend the hi-hat. So it feels like the hi-hat is a little bit longer and bigger, and that gives you the feeling of an open hi-hat without actually using an open hi-hat. Because I find that sometimes the open hats are a bit cheesy and too tech housey. So I use like a secondary hat, and I will even fade in a little bit so that the first hat kind of hits, and then the second one kind of takes over and extends the length of that hi-hat. It's a trick I use all the time. Make sure hi-hats feel bigger and not so tight into the grid. And then some vocoder to add a little bit of white noise and even more of a tail to it, some EQ. Clave, just percussion, shakers, simple. That same drum loop as before. Just with some other EQ, kind of taking out the clap and some of the high end. It's a great way to glue drums together, to have one of these full sounding textural shaker loops. I really recommend trying it in your tracks. Just a tambourine percussion. Nice clap. Another percussion that I've just taken from a drum loop, and I've pushed up this tone. Again, if I take that off, more of a knock. But with that up, it's more tonal, which helps it feel like it's more in kind of tune with the track and adds a bit of more melodic side to the drums. And then cutting this actually came from another percussion. So if I open this up, this is a percussion loop it came from. And I just took that, I dropped it in, and I just grabbed this one little section. I EQ'd out a ton of it. Right, so that's the original. This is mine, where I cut it, and then here, EQ'd the crap out of it. And then compressed the crap out of it. It's just a unique way of getting a different percussion sound from this. I try things like this all the time. I compress things really heavily. I take little bits of percussion loops, reverse them, resample them, stretch them, just to get different percussion sounds out of it. And, just to think outside the box to make some really interesting stuff. We have another percussion here. This one just EQing pretty heavily, like a barrel being hit. Another percussion. Snare roll. I like the snare roll a lot because it has a lot of reverb and some phaser on it, and I'm EQing out the top end. It sounds really nice when it builds up. It's very bulky, very old school, and it's just like... Right, it's huge sounding. And then I automate the phaser, the dry wet, the EQ as well. And it's such a big sounding buildup, and it's adding, to make these really big buildups like this, you can add a lot of noise, atmosphere, and sound like this. So that's why I have such a huge sounding snare. It's just adding more value to that buildup, making it sound even bigger and I guess like more full. Some risers. Don't know why these are in the drums actually, but here we are. Listen to all of them. And over here, I just have this little clap fill to keep the drums a bit more interesting. Did I nail that or what? All right, moving on to the synths. On the synths, I have this really nice wavetable preset that I made. It's a lead. I love that sound. I think it sounds super cool. So a very basic sound. It just sounds really nice. So the sawtooth wave, automating the cutoff throughout the track. Not really actually, just here. Maybe that got deleted by mistake. But this can open up and, play around with this and draw that in and make it even more interesting. But then I have the release automated as well. So there's parts of the track where I had it kind of growing with the release, like here, for example, so that it plays longer into this area. And I think that's all the automation I have on the way. Oh, and the unison amount. So this is really cool because it gives you like a more detuned effect. So this is like the detune, the unison, the width of it, and by pushing it up and down, I can make it feel bigger or like tighter to the sound and less detuned. Then I have some feedback, dry wet, and the compressor threshold is just for volume. For the big delay here, I wanted a bit of volume reduction. But anyways, the wider makes it wider, and to get this big sound, you have to make it in mono. So if I play it in poly, you're gonna hear 2 notes. But if it's in mono, when you play 2 notes, it will jump from one to the other. Well, it'll actually slide from one to the other, and it'll take 135 milliseconds to get there. Let me turn off all this reverb, and you can hear how much different it sounds, or how, not that exciting it sounds. It's a very simple sound. Then you can add the wider. It's a really nice sound. And then what I did to make that kind of like wafting is, instead of a pitch bend, I just added these little notes down here so that when it plays it, it tries to jump to those notes. And when the notes overlap, they blend into each other, they slide, but if there's a gap, they won't slide. So it's a combination of the gliding and the jump, like the playing of the notes, that makes this lead very interesting as well. It gives it dynamics, it makes it, unique, because not every note is playing the same. To get this really nice lead, I called it Lead Chaos, it's a preset that I made. I actually took influence from this pluck loop. That's from a sample pack. Actually, I do use these, but I don't use them as song builders. I usually will grab these and resample like things like this. Like I'll just grab this and, duplicate this a few times and see how that sounds. Stuff like that, or I'll stretch it out and make unique things here. But I love the way this one sounded, and I didn't want to just use theirs. I don't like using like song builders and stuff. So I decided to make my own by recreating that preset, and it sounds like this. I think it's pretty close. Mine's a bit more open sounding. I wanted it to punch through a bit better. And then what I did for the automation to make that really nice pitch rise, I love that. So intense. To do that, I automated the macro. So inside of Serum, I put the macro. So into the matrix, macro 1 is going to control a little bit of a coarse pitch. So the pitch here is going to rise. And if I raise this more, right? So that's this macro here, and that's what I've automated. And the sound itself without the EQ, it's just a pluck, a little bit of a distorted pluck here, simple pluck, pushing up the drive. It's a very mid-present pluck, and there is quite a bit of detune as well. That's how you get that nice wide feeling, and some delay, reverb, and a little bit more filtering to add that extra bit of punchiness to the pluck. Take that EQ off. Then there's some track spacer from 29, which is the lead sound. So they're a little bit overlapping, and I didn't want them to overlap too much. Then there's some impacts, just basic impacts, effects. Nothing special. But then here I have this cool weird effects. This vocal is a huge part of this track. It adds a lot of mid energy, and it carries the track really well. So I took this vocal and it sounds like some sort of like incantation spell or something, but I took that and I threw that in the track, and I added some a lot of reverb and delay, lots of feedback, and this is how it sounds. So what's really important about this placement of this vocal is that when the kind of attack of the vocal, when the vocal kind of hits here, it has to line up with the track. Otherwise, it's going to sound like there's a percussion or something off time. But notice how it literally hits with the beat of the music. Right? If that was off timing, it would sound a little bit weird. right? It just like, it takes you out of it. So it's important that when you're doing a vocal like this that's carrying so long into the drop, it has to like hit with the track. It has to hit on time, which is what I've done here. Let's see if I can get... That sounds really, really cool. Lastly, I have some pads just for adding tension. So they're a little bit calmer over here, and then in the drop, they're a bit more aggressive. And this lead sound was just something else that, again, increases the intensity, gives you that really big climactic moment, and it sounds like an alarm. So very cool sound. Basically, all it is it's the LFO is playing and it's opening the cutoff, and then jumping down. So it's like boop, 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 boop. Just simple sawtooth waves. And then it also is doing this to the pitch. So it's doing it to the cutoff. So the cutoff is closing, boop, and then opening. And then the pitch is also going up, then down, boop, boop, boop. And it gives it that nice energy in the drop. Love that. Some drones down here. I'm gonna wrap it up. These drones are really great for adding extra tension and glue. Without them, the track feels a little bit empty. There's still that tension pad up here. I'll turn that one off too. Right, it just ties all the high end together. Some one-shot sounds down here that I've recorded. Probably from this wavetable. Yep. So again, I made this preset. I think it's the same as the lead. I've just increased the attack by quite a bit, so it like slowly goes into it, and then I recorded it, and then brought down the pitch by a full octave, and that's how it gets that gritty sound, and then I record it again. Some risers, some crazy sounds. To get this big build up, I used a lot of sounds, especially this one here. This is like a riser, and I stretched it very far, and it gives you these like really big distortion. Right? It gives you these really weird artifacts, and it makes it very intense sounding. Combine that with the big building of the reverb of the drums. So the drums are increasing in reverb as it's building. Everything is adding white noise and atmosphere and tension. And then that gives you space for a very big climax and drop. Like I said, you want to grab the project file. You can click the link right here. If you want to see more track breakdowns like this, click this playlist. And if you want a video that YouTube thinks you'll like, then click right here.